So lesson 6.2 today is on using intercepts, and we have two different intercepts we're going to have to find. The first one is the y-intercept, and that is the y-coordinate of the point where the graph intersects the y-axis, and the x-coordinate is always 0. So if I drew a graph here, this would be the y-intercept because that's the y-axis that it's crossing. And for instance, if that ordered pair could have been something like over 0 and then up 2. So the x is always 0 on a y-intercept. The x-intercept is the x-coordinate of the point where the graph intersects the x-axis. The y-coordinate is always 0 for here. So here is where this graph is intersecting the x-axis. So this ordered pair could be something like over -2 and then up 0. So in these cases, we just want the x-coordinate or the y-coordinate. So the x-intercept here would be considered -2, and the y-intercept would be considered just the 2. For example 1, you're given a graph, and you're just asked to simply find the x and y-intercepts. So x-intercept, we look at the x-axis, which is right here, and we're crossing right there at -2, so my answer would be -2. The y-intercept is where does it cross the y-axis at? This is the y-axis, and we're crossing right here at +4, so 4 is my y-intercept. Now what happens if they don't give us a graph, but they give us an equation? Well, in the definition, we talked about how if it's an x-intercept, our y value is 0, and if it's a y-intercept, our x value is 0. So we just have to simply plug those values in. So I'm going to start off by finding the x-intercept. So that means I am going to plug a 0 in for y. So I'm going to have -3x plus 5, oops, not y. 5 times 0 equals 30. And 5 times 0 is 0, so that's going to go away, and I'm just going to have -3x equals 30. So what times -3 would give me 30? Well, that would be a -10. So my x-intercept is -10. And then for the y-intercept, I'm going to do the same thing, except for I'm going to put a 0 in where the x is. So I'm going to have -3 times 0 plus 5y equals 30. So now -3 times 0 is 0, so that's gone. And I just have 5y equals 30. So 5 times what is 30? That would be 6. So my y-intercept is 6. So these are my two answers. Now, I did a lot of writing here. You don't have to do all of this, because if you know you're plugging in a 0, then that chunk, that term, is going to be gone. So you can just skip right ahead to this step right here and figure out what you could times each of those coefficients by to get the 30 that we were looking for. So you don't have to spend all that time writing. All right. Oop. Example 2 says Sandia Peak Tramway in Albuquerque, New Mexico travels a distance of about 4,500 meters to the top of Sandia Peak. Its speed is 300 meters per minute. The function f of x equals 4,500 minus 300x gives the tram's distance in meters from the top of the peak after x minutes. Graph this function and find the intercepts. And what does each intercept represent? So first thing is f of x is really our y. So let's remember that. So we have this 4,500 minus 300x. It says graph first and then find the intercepts. I think it's easier to find the intercepts first and then graph using those. So that's how I'm going to do this, but you are more than welcome to graph using the y-intercept from our equation and then our slope. So in order to do this, If we want the y-intercept, our x is going to be 0. So we are going to have y equals 4,500 minus 300 times 0. So that would go away. So I would be left with y equals 4,500. So my y-intercept is 4,500. And then for the x-intercept, I'm going to put a 0 in for the y. Oops, equals 4,500 minus 300x. And then I'm going to have to solve. So I'm going to have to subtract 4,500. So that's going to be negative 4,500. And I have negative 300x left. And then we're going to have to divide by negative 300. So x on this side. A negative divided by a negative is a positive, and 45 divided by 3, because our zeros could cancel out, 45 divided by 3 would be 15. So our x-intercept is 15. And now we have to use those to graph. I'm going to go up by 1,000s on the y-axis since I have to get to 4,500. And so that would go right about there. And then the x-intercept is 15, so I think I'm going to go by 2s. So we have to go big enough that they fit, but also small enough that we can see details. So 15 would be right there. And then if I would graph, we have that line there. And it wants us to give what each intercept represents. So this ordered pair is over 0 and up 4,500. So if we look, it tells us that its speed is 300 meters per minute. And then it says the distance in meters from the top of the peak after X minutes. So our X value is our minutes. So if we go over here, this one is 15:0. So after 15 minutes, we are 0 meters from the peak. And over here, the X is 0. So after 0 minutes, so before you start, you are 4,500 meters from the peak. So in order to describe what each intercept represents in word problems, you just have to go back and figure out what does the X represent and what does the Y represent. And then you can kind of make your sentence out of those. All right, and then a couple more here. Use intercepts to graph the line described by the equation. So again, just extra practice. We're going to plug a 0 in for X. If I do that, I have 2 times 0 minus 4y equals 8. So that's gone, and I would just have negative 4y equals 8. And dividing both sides by negative 4, that would leave me with negative 2. So my y-intercept is negative 2. And then finding the x-intercept, I am going to put the 0 in for the y. So that would be gone, and I would just have 2x equals 8, and 2 times 4 would give me the 8. So my two intercepts, y-intercept is negative 2, and x-intercept would be 4. Ooh, and we got to graph that, I guess. I forgot that part. So y is -2, so here's -2 on the y-axis, and x is +4, so it's over here. And then we just draw our line through those 2 points. And then this one, if we put a 0 in for y, we would have 2/3 times 0 equals 4 minus 1/2 x. So this would equal 0. And then we'd have this 4 minus 1/2 x. We'd have to minus 4 from both sides. So we would have -4 equals -1/2 x. And our last step would be to divide by -1/2. So x on this side. And remember, we have to keep change flip. So we're going to keep the -4, but make it a fraction. Change to multiply. And then flip 1/2, so it becomes 2/1. Two negatives are going to multiply together to be a positive. 4 times 2 is 8. 1 times 1 is 1. 8/1 is the same thing as 8. And then we are going to have to do the same thing, but put a 0 in for the x. So that would cancel out, and we would have 2/3 y equals 4. And we would have to divide by 2/3. So y equals, and then keep the 4, make it a fraction, change to multiply, and flip 2/3. It becomes 3/2. The 2 and the 4 can be cut in half, so I end up with 2 times 3 on the top, which is 6, and 1 times 1 on the bottom, which is 1, and 6/1 is the same thing as 6. So our x-intercept is 8, y-intercept is 6, so they're both positive. I go by 2's, x is 8, so on the x-axis 8, and then 2, 4, 6, 8. Our y-intercept is +6, and then we can connect those and make our line through them.